So, if you guys don't know, Zach Gardner, Azure certified, and this topic kind of came out of a project that I'm doing. We were asked to put together a proposal for how a new application, complete greenfield, would look on Azure. So, dumb me, I went to Azure, I looked at all their options, and I was just like overwhelmed by all the different ways that you could possibly set up an application. I've been developing on-prem applications since Lord knows when. I know how to do that. But when it comes to Azure, there's so many different options that it's easy to see how there's so many different ways to do it and not really know what the right way to do it for your application is. So by the end of this, I hope that all of you will at least have a little bit better idea of, for the clients that we work with, not, some drag and drop thing that's going to make them like $1 bajillion. This is we're developing applications that are going to go to production, going to be used by tons of users, are going to make money for a business. How do we structure our applications to fit well? And what are the different ways that you could possibly do it on Azure? So just some baselines. If you all have questions during this, do whatever is most comfortable for you. If you like to raise your hand, do that. If you're like me and you just sort of shout out questions, that's fine too. If you want to wait till afterwards and pick my brain, totally fine as well. But I know my application. I don't know anyone else's. So you all are going to be working on applications, completely different domains in mine. Probably different in healthcare versus finance versus insurance. You might be working on legacy applications, or you might be doing greenfield applications. So as you're listening to this, think about the different types of apps that you've worked on or are working on or think you're going to be working on. How would this fit with the recommendations that I'm giving? And also, are you doing microservices or are you doing a monolith? There are strong arguments that can be made for both of those, and that impacts how you would structure your application on Azure. And then, probably most importantly, for the companies that you're working with, for these clients, how mature are they in their adoption of the cloud? Is a 65,000 person organization. It takes a while to move that ship over to point in the Azure direction. They have a lot of resources, but they're very immature when it comes to their Azure adoption. Some other organizations have been doing this for a year or two. So that might even influence how you would recommend they do one thing over another. So just for the sake of an argument, I came up with a mythical application called a bagel management system. And this management system would be able to be a microservice. So we're going to have one domain per, one microservice per domain. It'll be able to receive a bagel, bake a bagel, deliver a bagel, order the ingredients for bagels, and then, for Melissa, accounts payable and receivable. Because, you make bagels, you got to get paid somehow. So if this were a complete greenfield application, I'd probably have 5 microservices. I'd probably do .NET Core, because it's 2019, why not? And I might have some sort of queue between them, but I know I have at least 5 .NET Core solutions that I would want to be deployed to the cloud. So as I'm going through, that's sort of, if I were to implement this in all these different options, I will talk through some of the things that might go well, implementing them certain ways, and other things that might not be so fun. So as always, there are a lot of recommendations that I make. There's very few things that I would say I mandate you do, but one of the things that I absolutely mandate you must do when you go to Azure is rule number 1, don't talk about Fight Club. Rule number 2, don't talk about Fight Club. This is the exact same thing. When you go to Azure, you must create scripts to stand up your environment. It is so hard to make this stuff reproducible as you migrate from environment to environment. If you have to turn over to your support desk folks or your DBA folks, hey, creating this Cosmos DB application, it can't just be a one-liner in an email. You have to send them scripts. You have to maintain scripts that build up your infrastructure. Azure does actually a really, really, really good job, 90% of the time, in being able to script out, create this resource group, create this resource, create a VNet, create a network security group, tie all these things together. Say about 90% of the things that you could do on Azure, you can do through scripts. AWS, same thing, CloudFormation, Terraform. Whatever you do, make sure you're scripting it out.
So Zach, is there not a Terraform provider for Azure?
There is, and if that's what you want to go with, like, do that. No matter what you do, make sure you can script these things out, because you don't want to be having to describe to someone who's never used Azure before but is expected to create this resource for you, which happens. Well, we had DBAs that were like, hey, create us a Cosmos DB, and they're like, oh, can you give me the URL for Azure? I've never logged in. Like, that's a little frightening, so that your DBA will be creating this thing and never done it before. So do this so you don't have to worry about it. So this is rule number 1 of Fight Club. And 2. Rule number 3 is if these 2 things fail and you have to do something manually, make a playbook. This is something that if you had to write down steps for your grandmother's niece's sister, like a 5-year-old, someone that you have absolutely no relation to, you might never talk to in the real world, create a playbook that is absolutely so specific, there's no way that they could screw it up. So these are the only things that I mandate you do. Everything else, it's negotiable. But trust me on this. Even if you're using AWS or and use like IBM's cloud, like, do this. It'll save your life. So the very first option, and probably, I wouldn't say the option I would least recommend, but I would say really, really think about it before you do it, is to just create a bunch of VMs. I mean, all of us, when we're deploying on-prem, this is exactly what we've been doing for 20, 25, 30 years. Like, I've almost never deployed on bare metal. I always have some infrastructure person in some like dark closet provision me a VM, and they just give me a playground to do my things in. I can stand up IaaS however I want it. I can install any packages as I want. Like, I know how to do that. So it's very comfortable. It's very safe. It's very familiar. Like, this is the girl that you would take home to mom, in the local colloquials. I'm like, you know her. You know the things she's good at. And this, I would honestly say, is probably the preference for immature organizations by their IT staff and their InfoSec people. Northwell is looking to get on Azure. They called Microsoft and they were like, hey, we're going to need access to every single virtual machine you provision for us, even if it's on your platform as a service. And they were like, why? That kind of defeats the purpose of platform as a service. Like, oh, well, we need to log into these virtual machines and make sure that your security patches are up to date. And Microsoft was like, no, we're not going to do that for you. Because like Microsoft is much bigger and they're much better at doing those things that traditionally your IT, your patching people, they love doing that kind of stuff. And when you take that away from them by going to the cloud, this is what they see as their way to get job security.
And they produce the patches.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they manage these patches. They've been doing that for Lord knows how long. They're going to be very scared when you talk about platform as a service, because their job security just kind of gets thrown out the window, which is untrue, but that's going to be their perception of it. So this is actually probably what most immature organizations are going to want you to do. And we can't tell our clients no. We can give them things to think about. So one of the big cons for these VMs is they are expensive. Even at midnight on Christmas Day, you're paying for this thing. Even if there's absolutely no one in the world hitting it, even if no one is even thinking about your application, this thing is online and it is going to be costing your business money. And one of the reasons to go to the cloud is that you can pay as you go. You pay as you use things. These VMs, they're just sitting there burning money, whether you use them or not. And that can be not so good if you're looking for a really good business justification for moving to the cloud. A lift and shift means you pretty much take like the virtual machine image of your on-prem and dump it to a virtual machine in the cloud, which actually could be a pro. Maybe you have a really old legacy application that needs like IIS 4.3.7.9000 with some weird patch installed, and you don't really have a lot of real business rationale to like upgrade that app. So put it out on the cloud, let it do its own thing, while you work on some more greenfield microservice React stuff. Like that could be an okay. But honestly, in the words of Jay-Z, I got 99 problems, and the VM is one of them. It is so hard to stand up a VM and make it secure. There are so many different tools Azure provides for you to secure these things, configure their networking. And for a lot of us, we develop applications. We don't really define their infrastructure of their networking. Some of you might be VMware wizards. I'm not one of them. I don't pretend to be one of them. That's something that the client is always taking care of us. Whenever we go on site, we request a VM, they create it for us. How they secure that thing, make sure that no one can get in or out of it unless they really want to, that's something they take care of. If you create the VM, you are taking that responsibility on yourself. And for me, I don't want that to be my 99 problems. So I would say that there are some very, very specific use cases where you should use VMs. And if a client truly is dead set on doing this, make sure you really get them to think through it before you pull the trigger. The second one, it's not quite so dire, are app services. And it's hard to describe what app services are because they are so vast and so varied. A really good way of thinking about it is, for my .NET folks, it's like having an instance of IaaS in the cloud. You deploy to it, you can say, I want 5 instances running, and it takes care of the stuff underneath. For the Java folks, it's like having a Tomcat instance that you can just dump jars into. Or, well, you could do wars if you wanted to. It's 2019 though, get with the program. Or you could do, Spring Boot, just throw it these things, and it will take care of the deployment for you. It'll host this stuff, it'll create these instances, it'll do what you want it to. So it's similar to what we've been used to with VMs, but we don't get access to the actual machine itself. So it is IaaS-like, and it's actually really good for long-running jobs. If you have things that need to wake up, maybe some batch jobs that take 10, 15, 20 minutes to execute, to where they're rather long-running, this is actually something that's really good. I wouldn't quite recommend it for traditional CRUD applications. It's a little too overkill for it, and it doesn't quite fit it well. But there are some good use cases for it for long-running jobs. The con to these is definitely configuration. Again, we're not really infrastructure architects. We are application architects. And it gets a little difficult to know how to set these things up. I have to go through so many hoops to work with their infrastructure folks to make sure that we're securing our app services in the way that they want to. So the best advice I can give is, if you do want to go this route, make some friends on their IT staff for the client, get to know them really well, talk to them about their kids, they like that kind of stuff, and get their help. Get them to be on your side. Bring them into the process. Ask them their opinion. And if you can do that and get sort of their gold standard that you can fit within, that's probably a good way to use a lot of Azure's platform as a service stuff. So we'll see how that one goes. I'm still in the process of vetting it out with them. But what I would recommend for probably most of the applications that we do are their function apps. Serverless is the term that gets thrown around a lot. It's not actually serverless, because you always got to have a server somewhere. The best way I can think about how to describe these things, though, is it's a single function that you invoke, you give it some request, you save something to the database, or you fetch something from the database, or you up something from the database, and then you do a return. You don't have 20 different class layers that you have to go through to actually perform this action. It's typically all in one class, one method for your CRUD operations. So it's really, really good at doing that one thing, which is very simple CRUD, which is honestly most of the apps we work on. We get a list of things, you select something, you go to a form, fill some stuff out, you save it, you go back to the list. There's some batch jobs that might run in the background, but for simple CRUD, this is actually a pretty powerful case. So the con, though, is the fact that it is serverless. Because one of the things you're going to have to take into account are life cycles of things, like your database connection. You actually need to create a database connection when this app boots up and have all of the cases, all of the requests that come into that particular instance, reuse that database context. Otherwise, if you have to spin up a database connection every single time someone hits your API, that's going to cost you money, because you pay for these things based on how many times they get hit and how long it takes for it to respond. So if you make these things really short, really quick, then you're not going to pay as much. But if you're taking a second, maybe 2 seconds to respond, it's really going to add up. So be careful if you use this. It's still relatively new. There are some things that they're still working through. It takes some time, but overall, I've been fairly happy with this. And I would say for most of the applications we write, if you had to just give me sort of a 5-second, this is what my app does, I'd probably say a function app. So for my bagel management system, I would probably have 5 different solutions, 1 per microservice. I would have inside of there really 1 project for my function app, and then maybe a few controllers inside there, and then a few methods, create bagel, delete bagel, update bagel, and it would be maybe like 10 lines per controller method, and not really have to have, service classes or DAO classes. It would just all sort of be there, and I could see it as one piece, which feels weird, but honestly, I've actually been pretty happy with how it's turned out. As I said before, anything you do with your infrastructure needs to be done through scripts. And so I wanted to take this little interlude to kind of show you what that looks like. I have listed here on this left side all of the different scripts that it takes to build up my infrastructure. And I have them numbered so that if you're dumb like me and you forget which one needs to come first, you can sort it alphabetically. It's nice, it's fancy. And then you get the name of what it's supposed to do. And then, if you're forgetful like me, I also have included in, this is where I got this information for how to configure this particular part of my infrastructure. I have comments on there reminding me this is exactly why I wanted to do this thing. And then I have the actual script that needs to be run. You can take these, you can plug them into Azure. They have a CLI that's built into it. You invoke it, presto blammo. You get your infrastructure set up by just copying and pasting these commands in. I've gone through a lot. Are there any questions about anything I've gone through so far?
Were these scripts generated, or did you hand code them?
I had to do them. Azure does have the ability to, once you create something, you can press export on it, and it will create 3 or 4 files, depending, that will then, if you run that again, recreate that exact same resource. The problem is it'll recreate it as is. So if you have like one resource group for dev and you want to move one of those resources to a resource group for QA, you would have to know how to go into that script and actually change which resource group it's pointing to say, oh, actually point to this one. And it also is kind of like Hungarian notation inside of there. Like, it is real difficult to actually understand what it's doing. And just like with code, if you have really smart, really interesting code that works well, but you can't understand it, like, what good is it? Because you're not going to be able to maintain it. So what I've found with these sort of CLI type scripts that I have, if I want to talk through it with someone like you all, I can tell you exactly what this thing is doing. I'm creating a virtual network. This is going to be its name. This is its resource group. It's going to be in East US 2 because I work on the East Coast. This is going to be the CIDR block for the address prefix, and then this is the subscription I put it in. If I were to do this inside of the export template, it's like 4 files that are like 200 lines long a piece. There's like some like obscure JSON that it's outputting. Like, it's really hard to understand. Yeah, under the covers, Azure has what's called the Azure Resource Manager, and that's what you invoke when you want to tell it to change the topology of the different resource groups that you, or the resources that you have. And it accepts essentially JSON. So you can interact with that directly, or you can go through the CLI, which then creates the request to the Azure Resource Manager on your behalf. Yeah?
Which is their declarative way of doing it, like akin to CloudFormation?
Yes.
Okay. And instead of doing that, you're using PowerShell scripts.
Anything that you see that has like an Azure plugin or anything, is it under the covers going to interact with the Azure Resource Manager? So it's going to sort of by itself using their SDK, create these JSON requests that go to the resource manager that tell it to configure it. So this was very easy for me because it's straight from the docs. If I were doing something like a multi-cloud setup, then I probably would want to use something like Terraform, because then that abstracts me a little bit away from who exactly my cloud provider is. We do have a BAA with Google. Heaven knows why we have both Google and AWS, because why not? And I could do it like that, but for this, the application was all going to be on Azure, and this was just easier for me to write. So the Azure portal, as you're using it, it does actually do these things for you under the covers. And the CLI lags by about a month. When you see something available in the portal, it might take a little bit for the CLI to get that same functionality. But there are some things that you can't do in the CLI. Like if you see these here, these are my playbooks that I had to write out and say, this is what I want you to do. These are the things you need to click on. This is the order you need to click on them. And it stinks that you have to be able to do that, but there's honestly no way around some of these things. Like requesting an SSL cert, you have to do that manually. Or configuring things in a very specific way just had to be manual. I'll talk about an option that is actually not an option. It's like getting filet mignon medium well. Like you could do it, but you don't want to do it. If you see anything about Azure Logic apps, I would be very wary of how it would work for one of our clients. It's kind of a good parallel is like a WYSIWYG for like a rules engine, saying, oh, connect this thing, do this other thing, and then send an email, and then at the same time put something on a queue. These are really attractive for like the CIO types of people, where they're not in there coding every day, they just see these things, and it looks really cool when you use
great,
it.
right?
Yeah. Oh man, it looks awesome. But if you were to give that to a developer, like you can't, it is really hard to unit test these types of things, and that should immediately scare us. It's really hard to do this on anything in a medium or a large scale.
You can't really debug it or fix things
Yeah.
that are wrong. It's just doesn't work. Why doesn't it work?
Yeah.
I don't know. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because there's no code.
Yeah, exactly. It's very difficult to do these things. I wouldn't want to have my mortgage and my ability to pay it based off of using one of these things. Like that's the ultimate litmus test. If you ask a developer like, all right, these things that you're talking about are cool, would you want that to be what you're paid based off of? And if they say no or they hesitate at all, like that's what I get out of Logic apps. So I would just be very wary. It is an option, but it is also not an option. Something that Dallas has actually talked about and presented about it before is Azure Kubernetes Service. It's their managed instance of Kubernetes, somewhat similar to what Jamie presented with OpenShift. You probably don't want to use Kubernetes directly. I mean, you could if you're into that sort of stuff, but I really wouldn't recommend it. Pay someone to manage it for you and configure it for you, because it is extremely hard to do right. And this is their option for Kubernetes. So if you have a very heterogeneous application, like my Greenfield application, my bagel management service, I get to write it all, it gets to be in .NET Core, it's extremely homogeneous. If I had, some development team off in Jefferson City, Missouri that really liked Ruby for Lord knows why, and they were like, no, I'm using Ruby to write this microservice. And you're like, are you sure? And they're like, yes, you can't make me do anything else. So you're like, okay, well, some of these other options that I've talked about before don't really work. So if you have a very heterogeneous mix, there might be good reasons they wanted to do it in Ruby. It could happen. Then you would want to use something like Azure Kubernetes Service, because it allows you to deploy these Docker containers. You don't really have to worry about what's on the inside. You're exposing some port to the outside world, the implementation details of what's in there, neither here nor there. I would say the con to this is, for a lot of us, Kubernetes is probably fairly new, and if you're starting a new project or going on a new adventure in computer science, I would say you only get 3 new technology coins. You can spend them however you want, but you only get 3 of them. So you can't choose Kafka, RabbitMQ, Netty, and something else. You can only pick those 3 things. So if I were to do Kubernetes on Azure, I would want to make sure that I'm limiting myself to very few other new things. And if I couldn't, then I would use something that I know very well. Because for a lot of us, it's somewhat scary. Now you can, going back to the functions and the app services, you could, if you wanted to, wrap them up in a Docker image and then deploy them to here. Totally an option, totally fine. You get more out of Kubernetes when you have more of a microservice mesh that's in a very diverse set of technologies. If everything's very homogeneous, honestly, I don't know if I would go the Kubernetes route. But it is. It's always an option if that's your thing. Service Fabric is actually, I don't know if most of you know this, but Service Fabric is part of their platform as a service offering, and it is what most of Azure actually runs on top of. So Service Fabric is very well battle tested. It's similar to Kubernetes in that you can deploy stuff to it. You don't really have to know and care about what's going on inside. And it's actually pretty neat because it has some neat features like stateful and reliable services. Those allow you to, it's kind of abstract. You create microservices that don't have to go to the database every single time they get hit. It can actually maintain a data model locally inside that microservice that as you're updating it, it will update it in memory. And then when it so chooses, persist that to the database. Which sounds kind of cool. I don't know if we have a lot of applications that would really benefit from something like that, unless you're writing like a voting machine, maybe. And that's kind of frightening to write a voting machine. But that's kind of neat. The actor model allows for easier concurrent programming, is the easy way to explain it. Which for us, honestly, I don't know if we have too many applications that would do that level of concurrent programming because we're doing mostly CRUD applications anyway. But you know, it is an option. The con is it's actually kind of similar to what I talked about with virtual machines. You have to be the one, whenever you embark in Azure, to make sure that you know how traffic is coming into your application and how traffic is going out of your application. And as long as you work fairly well with a lot of the people on their IT team at the client, then you're probably going to be okay. Follow their standards, do what they have to do. If you kind of go rogue and do your own thing, I wouldn't really recommend it. The other con, which I didn't put up here but is worth mentioning, to use Service Fabric, you have 2 options. You can either give it Docker images and it'll deploy those just fine. Or you can create what's called a Service Fabric project. And it's sort of like an appendage to what your application, when you're running it locally, is. And it like hosts actually a local Service Fabric cluster on your machine, which is kind of cool, honestly, because you could create like a 5-machine simulated cluster locally and see how that impacts the performance of your application. The downside is that starting that thing up, I mean, Bernardo can attest to this, it takes a while. Like I can start up a new .NET Core API within like 10 seconds of me pressing the Start Server button. For the Service Fabric project, it's probably closer to like a minute for how long it takes it to actually boot up, depending upon your machine. So there are some hidden things that you don't really know until you get into there. So it is an option. It is something that I would say I'm seeing more people kind of trend to the Service Fabric route. It's more of like a Microsoft-y way of doing Kubernetes, but it does have some things that you just kind of got to watch out for. And again, to my bagel management service, I might go this route because I would have, you know, my own choice. It would all be in .NET. It would all be very similar. It would be sort of Microsoft from the beginning. So using their own Service Fabric, their own orchestration layer, it does kind of make some sense. If I'm only going to be expecting my APIs to get hit, you know, 30 or 40 times a day, this might be a little overkill. This would be for like your larger enterprises, probably medium to large, that have a lot of traffic and a lot of things going up and down that you don't want to have to worry about managing yourself. You could do it on a smaller scale. It just might be a little bit more than you want. So there is no right or wrong answer to any of this, as I found out. I played with several different ways of setting up my application. I landed on the function app just because it seemed to be a little more attuned to my needs, but you all know your clients better than I do. You know your domains better than I do. You know your end users and the other developers that you work with. So if you make recommendations, take all that stuff into account. You know, you might have a VP that is like super sold on logic apps, which can make it tough, honestly, to have these kind of conversations and to be objective about it and to come across as being in their best interest without telling them no outright. But whatever you do, these are only just options, and it's at the end of the day, it's the client's choice for how they set some of this stuff up. So be very positive about it. Talk about these things as, you know, opportunities, and give them a list of pros and cons, and just make sure that they are aware of this is a very new field for a lot of us. On-prem is one beast. The cloud is a different animal entirely. So look at the options, find the use case that you think your application would excel at. Is it a monolith? Is it a microservice? Is it greenfield? Is it legacy? Do you have very good developers? Do you have okay developers? What's the maturity level like? All these things should be taken into account. And if you want a recommendation, come see me. I can provide you some moral support, some comedic relief on some other things that we've gone through in our migration to the cloud. But at the end of the day, get in there, do a proof of concept. Remember rule of Fight Club, number 1 and 2, you got to use infrastructure as a code. It's the only way to do it. Everything else is optional. Everything else is, negotiable. Any questions or any clarification points I can add?
With your function apps, you didn't have vendor lock-in as a column? Is that...
Or pro. Microsoft is the most profitable company in the world right now. So
for who?
Yeah, I know. No, and that is something to take into consideration. If you're on the Microsoft stack, if you're using Azure to begin with, you're probably going to be stuck with them, which might not be, like I'm stuck with my wife. Like I have vendor lock-in. Like that's a really good thing. Like I really like her. So, I'm not as opposed to it as I used to be. One good thing that Azure does, fudge muffins, where are you? All right. Sorry, I talk like Butters from South Park all the time. Is the Azure Calculator. So as you're going through and speccing out, what exactly are the different resources that I'm thinking about, and like what would they really cost? The Azure Calculator actually does a fantastic job of allowing you to pick what region you want to do things in, what are the estimates that you have. And then if you go through, do all this stuff, you can actually export this too and share it. So it'll give you like what it estimates you're going to be spending on this stuff. So you can really do like an apples to apples comparison. Like if money is an object and you want to see like what they're going to be charging them, plug it in. Show them this is the difference if you're running a VM all day, whether anyone hits it or not, versus doing pay as you go. So money sometimes speaks better than we could.
Does Azure have like good tooling for alerting, logging, APM insights, stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, App Insights is what they use for. You could do log aggregation on it, but it's more for alerting and like sending out text messages and stuff. And they actually have really good billing alerts. You don't, it's kind of a word of advice, you don't want to have an alert sent out when you exceed your bill for the month. You actually want to send it out like when you exceed 50%. So that way you at least have a little bit of lead time before you like burn through all of your cash. It does have a lot of really good resources that will, detect that kind of stuff and to be able to do things like that. And if you do want to play around with it, if you create, I think a new MSD, or if you create like a new Microsoft account, like if you use Hotmail still, if you're weird like me, you get like $150 a month to just sort of play around. And as long as you delete your resource group after you're done playing, then you don't keep accruing charges. And that's why the scripts actually come in handy, because when I want to, when I'm done for the day, I delete the resource group, I don't have to worry about the cost, and when I come in the next morning, I run through the scripts again in the same order, presto blammo, I have my infrastructure back as it was. And it actually makes sure when you do that you can recreate it. You don't see anything, odd going on. So I would definitely recommend the scripts to anyone and everyone. It's the one thing I evangelize on.
Your startup time in the morning.
It takes me, this infrastructure, it takes about, I think, 10 minutes for me to run through the scripts. Some of them are like super quick. Others of them take a little while to provision the resources in Azure. So, start that, go roast my coffee, come back when I'm done.
Oh, DevOps, we have some projects using the portal, right? That's the DevOps portal. You said when you were talking about the portal, you're talking about the DevOps portal that has, it's like a Heroku, right?
That is a great question. They now have their own instance of TFS in the cloud. And it's not your dad's TFS. It's actually legitimate and is something that I would recommend that you use. So the Azure portal, what I was referring to, is the thing that allows you to see your resources, see your resource groups, create new things, just kind of mess around. Very similar to the AWS console or the AWS portal. Azure DevOps is what allows you to provision different Git repositories, and then it also manages your CI/CD as well. So honestly, setting up some of this stuff was a little too easy.
Yeah.
All I had to do was I would go like here, and I would be like,
Is this TFS under the covers? Oh, okay.
yeah. So I would say, oh, here's my API.
Super sweet.
I want to do, it's a .NET Core function app that I want to deploy to here. Click continue, blah, blah, blah. Function app name. It reads it from there, validate and configure, and it generates what's necessary to do these build, like it does like the NuGet restore, it does the deployment, and then I say, oh, when I want you to deploy, like deploy to my dev instance. Like it managed all that for me, and all I had to do was do a few clicks. What you're gonna run into when you work with a large organization is they're gonna want control over the resource groups, and if you have access to any development or QA resource group, they're going to give you read-only access at best. You're not going to be able to go in there and monkey around. So they are going to be the ones that provision these sort of resource groups for you, and you tell them, hey, I want this thing to deploy over here. And then you're going to get the question of, well, what's the URL for Azure, because they're never logged in before. So that's where the playbooks come in handy. Yeah, you typically will get, almost everything for us is provisioned. They can do sandboxes, and if you do want to play around in Azure and not do it on your own time, definitely ask the client for a sandbox. If YAML's your thing, you could like go in and monkey with it, but more often than not, I just click save and run, and it works. So this is the thing that does your CI/CD pipeline, and then the Azure portal is what allows you to go in, create these resources, monkey with stuff if you have access. Very similar to the AWS console. Good. Any other questions? So Azure's exciting. I would recommend it. Well, thank you all very much for your time.